Dear colleagues, friends,
Okay.
ladies and gentlemen, my name is Alexander Fidora, and it is a pleasure for me to welcome all of you to the Disputatio of Barcelona, also on behalf of the academic director of the Barcelona Knowledge Hub, Ricard Guerrero, who is among us tonight. The Barcelona Disputation was established by the Academia Europaea and the Barcelona Knowledge Hub in 2013, and since then we have met every fall. Unfortunately, due to the vicissitudes of the year 2020, we had to postpone our 8th Disputatio. Today, we are both happy and proud to be back again. When establishing the Barcelona Disputation, we took inspiration from the medieval Disputationes, which offered a formalized method of controversial debate between two scholars, either masters at the university or representatives of different faiths. Most famous is the Disputation of Barcelona, called for in the summer of 1263 by King James of Aragon. During this debate that lasted for 4 days, Friar Paul the Christian was pitted against Rabbi Moses ben Nachman from Girona, one of the foremost Jewish intellectuals in his time. The subject of their sophisticated discussion was the Messiah, and more specifically, the question whether the Messiah had already come in the person of Jesus Christ. This disputation ended with Nachmanides in exile in Palestine, where he died only a few years later. I'm not sure where our disputation tonight will lead us to, but at least I can promise you that nobody will be exiled in the end. So a medieval method for a pressing question of our time, that is the complicated relation between cities, climate, and pandemics. Yes and no. In fact, also medieval authors were aware of this nexus. I don't want to steal our speaker's time with boring historical digressions, which I'm somehow prone to, as this is my field of research. Not boring digressions, but history, in fact. But allow me to draw your attention to a paragraph by Francesc Eiximenis, that is a 14th century philosopher and theologian from Girona. In his chief work called Lucrezia, the Christian, Eiximenis devotes a chapter to presenting his vision of the ideal city. Eiximenis concludes his sketch of city planning with a remark on where hospitals and also bordellos should be built. Hospitals, llocs de leprosos i bordells deuen estar a la part contrària d'aquell vent que més se usa en la ciutat, per tal que el vent aquell no tir les infeccions del dit lloc, ans les ne lluny i no les hi leix acostar. That is, hospitals, leprosaries, and bordellos should be built in that part of the city which is opposite to the most frequent wind in that city, in order to avoid that the wind spreads the infections from this place. Rather, the wind should take away the infections from the city and not allow them to get into it. End of quote. Eiximenis' draft for an ideal city, on which, as I only note in passing, the architect Puig i Cadafalch wrote a remarkable monograph. This draft for an ideal city is a very early example of how to take seriously the interdependence of urban planning, health, and climate issues. At present, awareness of their entanglement has become even more urgent as we face irreversible climate change, urban sprawl, and an increase of population density along with habitat destructions, which favor zoonotic transmission. As World Health Organization Chief Tedros recently said on the occasion of the first International Day of Epidemic Preparedness, and I quote again, "Any efforts to improve human health are doomed, that is, will fail, without fighting climate change." Or, as the UN Secretary General put it more drastically, nature always strikes back. Tonight's disputation tries to meet this challenge by putting the pandemics into the larger picture, approaching it from the perspectives of urban planning and environmental economics. Our first disputants is Katrin Golda-Pongratz, architect, urbanist, and urban researcher. She is a professor at the Barcelona School of Architecture of the Universitat Internacional de Catalunya, and also an associate professor at the Department of Urban and Territorial Planning at the Universitat Politècnica de Catalunya. She is a member of the Academia Europaea. Her research focuses on urban memory, urban culture, and public space, post-colonial urbanization, non-formal urbanism, and place-making strategies. Among her publications, I will only mention her book on John F.C. Turner, which was distinguished with the 2019 FAD Award. She also has a documentary film, Ciudad Infinita, Voces del Ermitaño, which portrays a self-built neighborhood and ecological threats through urbanization in Lima, Peru. Jeroen van den Berg, our second speaker, is ICREA research professor at the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology of the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona and honorary professor of environmental economics at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. Like Katrin, he is a member of the Academia Europaea. His current research is on the interface of environmental economics, energy climate studies, and behavioral sciences. He currently leads an ERC advanced grant on the topic Behavioral Evolutionary Analysis of Climate Policy. The title of his latest book is Human Evolution Beyond Biology and Culture, published in 2018 by Cambridge University Press. I very much thank both speakers for accepting our invitation to participate in this Disputatio, and particularly for their willingness to perform on an entirely virtual stage tonight. Let me finish with a brief note of housekeeping. Each of our disputantes will have 20 to 25 minutes to make their point. Afterwards, they and we, the public, may engage in discussion. For this purpose, I kindly ask you to use the question and answer section of this webinar, the Q&A option. The floor for the Disputatio of Barcelona 2020 is now open. May I invite you, Katrin, to start with your presentation?
So I hope you can hear and see everything well. Good evening, good afternoon, maybe to some of you. Thank you very much. First of all, thanking Ricardo Herrero and the Academia for the invitation. Thank you very much, Alexander Fedora, for leading our debate, and Jeroen van den Berg for sharing this Disputatio with me. I'd also like to thank Kim Kate and the technician Ernest for organizing everything and making this happen tonight. Feliz de poder salir a la calle, happy to be able to leave the house, is what is noted happily, as you can see here on the street in Paseo San Juan. That was in May, early May, when we were, after the strong lockdown, we were allowed back to go on the streets. So tonight, unfortunately, the situation is not for going out and not for going to the academy, and not for gathering in the Prat de la Riba hall as it would normally have been usual in Barcelona, and then gathering in the courtyard, connecting in a physical space. Needless to say how much the pandemic has impacted our urban and cultural life. I am, as we are all sitting at home, and in a second we will discuss the role of the home in these pandemic times. Nevertheless, the online format allows a synchronization of the local and the global context, and allows also to have colleagues and friends and other interested people to be connected from all around the world. So I'm sending my greetings to all of you, and I thank you for being here on the screens, even though not visible as it should be in a room that we share. Indeed, I think we could not touch upon a topic more relevant to all of us all over the globe, and the need for a global co-responsibility, a sticking together and showing respectfulness in this one world island in a one world ocean, as Richard Buckminster Fuller, the engineer, called it in the 1930s. It could not be larger. The current situation has not only confirmed a conviction that I have since a long time, the need for holistic thinking and for interdisciplinary research and for going beyond disciplines. And I'm really happy that tonight I can share ideas with Jeroen, and that we follow this idea of science and of thinking together and of sharing ideas in this interdisciplinary field. Well, the initial solidarity that we have all been praising in the beginning of the pandemic has also thrown us back to insecurity and fears. It has produced, all the situation has produced a loss of publicness. And it has, as we see here and as we see in our common situation, it has thrown us back into the tiniest element of the city, which is our house, which is our home, which is the place that we are now sitting in, and which is suddenly has acquired this condition of a lecture hall, of an unexpectedly and unwilling hypertrophic role in our life. And in the majority of the cases, the condition is of what it needed for is not necessarily prepared. We throw ourselves back into this isolation. We feel we need to feel protected, and this let's say critical statement from the 1970s couldn't be clearer in this moment. If we examine cities in a closer way, we see that there is a vast amount of substandardized housing, homes without electricity, windows overlooking tiny interior courtyards, homes shared by people who take turns between working and sleeping, overcrowded homes without privacy for any inhabitant, poor quality housing where any sound from the neighbors can be heard. So this is the common condition for many of us who we have to stay at home and who have to stay in our home. In general terms, we can say that all housing is now undergoing exam. The fencing that might suggest proof lack of security here in this inner center development of relatively recent development in Berlin also proves a lack of flexibility and of adaptability. There's a lack of proximity of basic needs in many of the exclusive and unmixed neighborhoods that have been created recently, but follow the trend of modern planning ideas, separation of living and other functions in the city. Or speculation-driven urban renewal, like here in Barcelona, where small-scale homes with close contact to nature, you can see some remaining of them here, have been replaced by monofunctional blocks. So housing here clearly is a product and not a process. And the quality of life is questionable in times that we are going through, if not in general. And that brings us to understand that the idea of a healthy community, of mutual neighbor support, and especially to be the self-sustainability and health that is, let's say, given in small gardens, as we can see here, allotments and terraces, that these conditions are much more present in these originally self-built neighborhoods, from where urban planners and city ecologists can learn a lot from, I understand, and I think, and I'm convinced of. Elsewhere, in Lima, for instance, in Peru, the situation is even more alarming. Here in this settlement, in general in Lima, for example, a third of the population of the households live in high or extreme poverty. Makeshift dwellings are made of lightweight materials. The inhabitants are not protected from the cold or the heat that they are exposed to the humidity presently constant in Peru's capital's atmosphere. So the houses they live in and the economic conditions are clearly not for staying at home. This is, and it is, we can say that, and we can also put this up as a hypothesis for ongoing and for further research. This is the end of a historic cycle, in the sense that the insistence of the economic consequences are all over, but there are no sufficient answers to the fact that the city is economy and exchange, and that a lockdown and confinement, especially in cities where the majority lives in non-formal or informal conditions, is the end of the city as a promised place. And I'm showing you two photographs that I think are really show a paradigm change. This one here, an urban exodus in April 2020, people massively leaving Lima on foot under the threat of COVID and the quarantine, which has left them without work and without any means to subsist. So the decision is made to return to their villages of origin. And in fact, exactly the opposite to what they have been going on and searching for 60 years before, towards the city and the urban dream, the rural migrants getting into the city and settling and starting constructing places to live. we could say it could be a hopeful sign that settlements are in crisis, and settlements, not very well consolidated settlements here, as we see, that are also threatening natural conditions and archaeological spaces, have stopped to be a model in this very moment. But this is not really a hopeful sign, because there is no real offer of any alternative to the inhabitants at the moment, and they are left in even more desolate conditions than ever before. On the other hand, and if we speak about this idea of sprawl and of extension and of individualization, if we look at this neighborhood in Los Angeles in the United States, but we can look anywhere else in richer parts of the world, we see that the taking up of nature and spreading of individual homes is everywhere. And at the same time, and this is really worrying, I feel, the request under the COVID outbreak is even increasing. People are fleeing, people are, let's say, leaving the city, people are worrying about more individual space, social distancing and sprawl. Is there a correlation? Of course there is. And it will certainly, houses will occupy more space for home, for office combination. People want to move out, people want to be in touch with nature, and people have this new and old fear of the city and the conglomerate, meaning, of course, that this is a car-dependent development. Would that mean, and that we have not learned from the past, where even the most recent urbanistic failures, as we can see here, are standing like open wounds in the landscape, where car dependency and speculation created uninhabitable spaces. We see here a photographic project that I've undertaken in the outskirts of Madrid some 6 years ago. But not necessarily, it's not only Madrid, it's also Barcelona, that claims to be the compact city, is not free from the danger that its hinterland is being gradually taken up by urban sprawl, people wanting to move out, people wanting to leave the dense city, as density is more and more considered as a threat, as a cause for more infections, and as the antithesis to living in touch with nature, which it not necessarily is. And just to say that this photograph is taken from one of the few flights that I've made in the recent months, and you see the clarity of the air, which really shows us that the pollution has dramatically gone down in the recent times. So density as a health threat, is that really the case? Is that really a question we have to ask? It seems we do, because it's in all over the press, and it's discussed everywhere in the urban debates. And in some ways, it is an idea that was already bothering the modernists like José Luis Sert in the 1940s, where this, let's say, the critique of the industrialized, the crowded, the ill-ventilated, the unplanned and unhealthy cities was on the table, where the idea was that, let's say, this phenomenon of overcrowding, other than density, Sert did distinguish here, was on the table, but was still giving space to the confusion of both concepts, and is currently, as I've just mentioned. So if we look at recent research, if we look at this paper that looks into the debates that go on the why New York is so affected by the pandemic, we can see COVID-19 thrives in larger cities, not in denser ones, is the outcome of that research. And there's other current researchers clearly saying that it's not so much the big cities, but it is the global cities. So it is more the connectivity of cities that makes causes rise. Lombardy and Milan, for instance, as part of the international clothes production chain in its fluent exchange with China and with the world at the beginning, Wuhan and New York, as not as the size, but the degree of connectivity that matters. And Barcelona, and that's also to be seen in the distribution scheme of the incidences, is not in Barcelona. Not the densest neighborhoods are the most affected ones, as we can see. So it is clearly not so much a question of density, and we should also be careful with, let's say, dramatizing the debate about density, but it is about the relation between the public and the private space and user behaviors and traditional and non-traditional ways of living in cities in general. What I suggest is that we rethink the city as an organism, and it will be interesting because we have some biologists in the audience, so there might be also some comments here to learn from their contributions into the field. In any case, I would like to mention one of the outstanding figures, the biologist and urban planner Patrick Geddes, who is somebody whom we can learn from again and again. In fact, important at the beginning of the 20th century as one of the persons that started to create the interdisciplinary research idea in the field of urban planning, nature as a relevance, and let's say the respect to nature and to the territorial logics, and also the idea of the importance of the watersheds in a section that you do from the hills to the sea, to take always into account. We can also have a look at these interesting experiments, if you will, in the beginning of the 20th century in Frankfurt, in fact, in a mass planning, let's say mass housing planning proposal by Ernst May in the turn of the beginning of the 20th century, where self-sufficiency, contact to nature was all proposed by Leberecht Migges' tree of waste and the proposal for these allotment gardens, and was not a utopian thing to think that this is also possible in an urban and even in a mass housing context. In the case of Barcelona, clearly Ildefons Cerdà is a figure to learn from and is present in the debate. The engineer who laid out the city of the infinite grid, if you will, the extension of the old city of Barcelona in the mid 19th century, who based his thoughts on a theory of the building of cities and the theory of urbanization, which sets the beginning as urbanism as a discipline. And he was very much influenced by the high mortality rates of the working class population, poor health conditions and educational conditions, and also all of those issues pushed him to design a new type of city. He proposed, and these ideas of directions of winds and of where to locate buildings was clearly there in the planning of Cerdà. Proposed gardens in the center of the street blocks. In his first treaty of urbanism, he lays out the way of how the Eixample of how this extension of Barcelona should be. The width of the blocks, the inner let's say gardens in between, in the centers, rich and poor accessing same services, so social equality was also on the forefront, and smooth flowing traffic were among his utopian sounding ideas, many of them having been materialized. On the right you see a scheme that shows the development of one of the Eixample blocks in reality. So speculation has been driving also this development, as you can see. So there is not too much left of the block in between gardens, but there's a lot left from his ideas. And we can see that in the current debate, and this might have been pretty well pushed by the COVID debate and by the pandemic situation, the idea of creating super blocks, of creating a new layout of urban green in the streets of the entire Eixample of this extension of the city goes back to the ideas of Cerdà, giving back the streets to the city's inhabitants, driving force for gentrification, also as it has been before, but is now really pushed into a traffic calmed kind of urban proposal, which goes back interestingly to the superblock proposal of modern times of the 1930s. And if you see on the top, this combination of 3 by 3 blocks into a super block is there already in the idealization of a modern city, of a modern Barcelona, of a fluid Barcelona. And this comes back in the proposal of systems and networks at the beginning of the 21st century, when the service district, Població, is transformed into post-industrial district, smart city discourse, and the relation of flows, and the starting of a street calmed 3 by 3 block, which you can see here on the right, which is one of those, let's say, super illas in Població, where citizens use the street. Of course, this is also not a new idea, because the neighborhood claims for more green space in the city have been present since the 1970s, and we can say it is now applied in we could say soft top-down approach. And at the same time, and this is why I'm also putting it here, it is now maybe providing a new way of really understanding the city, but it's also into question the city that surrounds this block, which is office blocks, and which cease probably to be a persistent urban typology. In any case, we go with these super IA proposals into a new mobility paradigm, which is in fact a big question if that really is to come, if we know and if we see that Barcelona, despite of its excellent public transportation system, is very car and very motorbike related, dependent, and shows severe pollution indices. You see on the left the proposal of investigation that's hopefully going to be shown at the Venice Biennale this year. And we see the, let's say, the city redrawn after, according to the pollution levels that it has. And the proposal on the right that really suggests to calm the traffic in the entire Eixample as a new transportation paradigm in that sense. New pop-up bike cycling lanes, walking lanes have appeared, and tactical urbanism in the center of Barcelona in the recent months. So the coming of Via Laietana, of one of the main streets that's very much debated, has also caused immense resistance from the central city's small businesses. And the pandemic has probably made possible much faster action, but the laboratory effects are still less evident, I would say. In any case, there is a huge press echo. There is a lot of criticism also made for criticism of just coloring the streets. But it's clear that the mayor, Ada Colau, she wants to go for a new Green Deal. She wants to make Barcelona as one of the cities on the forefront of, as she says, a green revolution. There are, of course, quite a number of contradictions in all those intents to make Barcelona a more sustainable city. Beyond, first of all, the fact that waste collection and waste production in the city is still far away from standards in other European contexts. Solar panels are still on the way to be, even though we have so much sun here, which is something that has to do with central decisions, but is pretty not very well understandable. We have also a huge contradiction when it comes to access to housing. The fact that housing has become so expensive in the recent years, really a product in an incredible way, and that this really weakened the community networks in the city throughout, something that becomes much clearer now in the times of the pandemic, because we see that there's, for small businesses, a very hard time to cope, to subsist in a city that embraces gig economy, online commerce, and has developed few means so far to support the small neighborhood commerce, especially in neighborhoods where the absence of tourism shows the amount of population that has already been pushed out in order to maintain these businesses alive. So this is a major, major challenge. We see, and that's another big contradiction, we see empty and locked up hotels standing versus the need of spaces. There's claims even from the university in the field of architecture. Why can we not use all these large empty spaces in the city and not being able, instead of not being able to meet in physical, in these, let's say, specific conditions. And apart from the fact that in the neighborhood that you see here on the screen, beyond the emptiness of the hotels, there is still people being pushed out and evicted from their homes. So this issue of the social city is very much at stake here, and is an increasing issue under the threat of the pandemic. So there is no question that there is a leading role for the cities to go. There's no doubt that cities have to lead, have to go beyond national legislation, as already was shown in the question of how to deal with the refugees. Cities have created alliances. Paris and Barcelona are very close here. And not only to learn from Cerdà, and you see here again proximities in the approaches in the 19th century, and in this idea of the 15-minute city proposal for Paris, which we can learn also here from our point of view from here. So everything should be in a distance of 15 minutes, in a walkable distance. And that would also, of course, mean a reinforcement of neighborhood as the strongest asset of a city and guarantee for the creation of values in the city. Barcelona, as you see here, an election campaign poster from 20 years ago, Barcelona is not afraid of dreaming. It has never been afraid of dreaming. And we see here ideas that have been on the table many years ago: solar energy, water recollection, even a river connection between the two, connection between the two rivers. There's lots of ideas that have not been realized, but are still there. What we can see is being incredibly well realized is the bicycle city, which 20 years ago was nearly unimaginable that Barcelona would ever be a cyclist city. So there's a lot of material on the table that we should take up from and to get back to. And clearly what is important is when we zoom out again and go to the territorial condition and to this idea of the Metropolitan Development Plan to 2026, the necessity of having a more sustainable development, and not only of thinking in terms of car dependency, but much more in terms of a interrelated conglomerate that allows for a healthy living environment and opposes against the sprawl that I've been mentioning at the beginning. So the regional scale and peri-urban ecology are, for me, the most important points to touch on and to go for. And I would like to show this image before closing with some provisional conclusions. This image from El Vallès, seen from close to Centelles, and in fact this is where Ildefons Cerdà was born, and this view that he must have had before even, let's say, creating the extension of Barcelona, the view of the landscape connection between the hills, the flatlands and the sea, and this idea of having an interrelated ecological system is, I'm sure, has influenced in his idea of how to create a city network. So some provisional conclusions that I would want to put up here before we go and hear a different point of view from Jeroen, and we look into what it means to have environmental aspects taken into account, for me is clearly the importance to the need to recognize and foster the role of the city as a space of creation of new values, of participation and of exchange, of whatever exchange that could be also in a, hopefully at some point, not too capitalist, post-capitalist, or whatever kind of situation we can create in the cities. The importance of spatial justice, as Edward Soya, the geographer, has claimed for decades ago, the importance of spatial justice in an urban context, and the imperative, and that's for let's say the discipline that I belong to, the urban planning and the architecture, of obviously the imperative of caring for nature. This can no longer be disrespected. It has been for too long of a time, and Spain has some tremendous, let's say, heritage still from that period. And I'm saying that also because it's not only about making more livable cities in general, but as we also certainly agree that the pandemics, and this is what the biologists and the virologists also can confirm much better, but the pandemics is also related to this extractive way of how we have been dealing with nature. And this pressured remaining nature next to the expanded landscape of the Barcelona airport is an image that shows us this let's say question whether we want the city only to be an infrastructural hub, or whether we should degrow even these infrastructures and we should rethink the nature that is still remaining and is being urbanized, and to get into a much more harmonious and less conflictive and more integrative way of understanding these landscapes as spaces for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Katrin, for your presentation. Leaving, as I said before, questions and comments, remarks to the end, we continue immediately with Jeroen's presentation. So Jeroen, the floor is yours.
Yes. Thank you, Alexander. Can you hear me loud and clear? Thank you also to the Barcelona Disputation and the Barcelona Knowledge Hub of the Europaea for inviting me and for organizing this timely debate. I enjoyed Katrin's lecture tremendously. Beautiful. Barcelona is such an interesting city, and you put it in a wider global historical context. You clearly know a lot about cities, and I'm impressed. I come from a different background. I used to work coincidentally in a department on spatial economics, as we called it, with regional and urban economics and transport economics as an important dimension. I still have a link to that department, but I was a bit of an outsider working on environmental economics. But I have published reasonably a lot on these topics, but from a different perspective. And I didn't work much in the last period on these issues, but coincidentally, I recently got triggered by an interesting question on the boundary of cities and climate, and also more recently even about the potential link between the COVID pandemic and the resulting confinement, and how that affects people's ideas, perceptions, and opinions on climate solutions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these issues and try to connect them. So it's interesting that the cities, in the beginning of the debate on climate change and solutions to it in the 90s, cities didn't appear as such an important dimension, but after the Kyoto Protocol, things changed. And that had to do with the fact also that the successor to the Kyoto Protocol didn't come about. There's quite some gap between the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. 10 years, even though there were annual meetings at the highest level internationally with world leaders coming together to strike a climate agreement, there was failure after failure, and people gave up a little bit on national governments, and a lot of the observers put great hopes in the potential role of cities. And interestingly, you see also that people tend to be very critical of governments, but less so of cities, both with regard to how COVID is handled, I think, and especially how climate is handled. Whether that's fair and justified by the data is something that I want to examine. I'll be deconstructive during part of my lecture, but I'll try to be constructive towards the end, because my purpose is to contribute to a better perspective on how we can use the potential of cities to solve climate change, because that potential is great, but I have the feeling we still haven't come close to exploring it. But there is a lot happening. So there are a lot of networks of cities. I mentioned them here in the slide. There's also a lot of jargon, city intelligence, reinventing cities, transforming urban lifestyles, etc. So there is a lot happening, but as always in science, there's a lot of dynamics, but before reality changes, that's often with a lot of delay and a lot of intermediate steps. But it's clear if you look at the literature on cities and climate change, especially what I'm interested in, not so much adaptation, but mitigation, as it's called, reduction of emissions, solving climate change rather than adapting to it. There's a lot of optimism. And I cite here from several articles in the top level of science, Nature and Science, which all suggest that cities contribute or are responsible to about 70% of all emissions. And I've seen that repeatedly being published. And of course, at a certain moment, people start to repeat what others have published. If it was in Nature and Science, it must be true. There's some studies that have more moderate figures, but still large, 53 or to almost 90, around 40. And my claim here will be that these numbers are exaggerated. They don't bear a clear relationship to concrete urban policies. So I'll try to convince you of that. It's very risky because it's my first venture into this area. And also, I didn't come across good research that tried to look at the big picture. There's a lot of micro level research, but to put that together into a big picture is extremely difficult. So I'm just scratching the surface of this and trying to give ideas for further thinking about this and for debate in this moment. So my framework to analyze this has this structure. So in the center, you see three components which represent together a decomposition of effectiveness. So I'm interested very much in, okay, we have a lot of policies. We have a policy mix consisting of 4 types of policies. I'll talk about it in a moment. And how to judge these policies from the perspective of emissions reduction. Well, people use the word effectiveness a lot, but there's a lot behind it, and I try to decompose it. And so I think reach is important. How many emissions do you reach with your policy? For instance, cities do a lot in regard to their own buildings and their own car fleet. But that's all nice to show a good attitude, but it reaches really very few emissions. Capability is another characteristic of policies. Some policies are very capable to make changes because they forbid something hardly. Other policies are very soft. They give information, try to change people through that, and they're less capable. And there's a whole world in between, of course. And then we have stringency. Some policies are very stringent because they set strict norms or standards, or we have a high environmental tax level. Others are weaker. They have low taxes. And as we see, for instance, now carbon taxes are implemented in many places around the world, but they're still extremely weak. I calculated with a colleague that the average price of carbon taxes, prices around the world, where they are implemented, is about $7 per ton of emissions. That's really very little, because other studies suggest that we need to reach at least $100 per ton of CO2 to make a difference. So I could say more about this framework, but given the time, I'll go to some qualitative results. And in this table, I summarize a review of the empirical literature of about 60 studies that try to assess how effective policies have been. And I've tried to disentangle this effectiveness in these 3 dimensions, as you see. And I do this for the 4 types of policies. So now I come to these policies. Self-governance I mentioned already. So the city can try to change its own climate, carbon footprint. Provision of services can be done, for instance, through public transport. With public transport, you can try to get people out of the cars and in that way reduce emissions. Enabling means that you provide information, sometimes subsidies, to change behavior of people. And regulation means that you prohibit things, or you make some things that are very carbon intensive, very unattractive. And what you see is that, these policies are very different in terms of reach, capability, and stringency. And if you then look at the overall picture of the current effectiveness, you see that self-governance has a moderate impact, provision of services a low impact, enabling a low impact, and regulation a low impact. If you look at the maximum level, I've tried to estimate that, then in my view, you could get them all at a moderate level, but it will be very difficult to get them at a high level. And to show why that is, I'll dive in a little bit of quantification. So here, I look at this overall effectiveness, and I measured it as a proportional contribution of cities to global emissions reduction. And you can disentangle that as the global share of cities with serious climate policies and their average effectiveness. And that effectiveness can then be disentangled into this reach, capability, and stringency. If I do a very rough estimation based on these empirical studies and the data that come out of it, I arrive at 6% that cities currently contribute to emissions reduction. That sounds negative, sounds low, but you have to realize also that's consistent with what we see because we don't see emissions reduction. If this would be 30%, we would see it, and we would see actual emissions reduction. We don't see a lot because it's low. Now this, if I take for the 4 components a more optimistic perspective, half of their maximum value, then only then I will achieve 6%. So it's not very high. Now, these are very rough estimates. We're talking about a complex system. I'm trying to approximate this, so I'm looking at it from a different perspective, where I use a more disaggregated framework, where I disaggregate cities, policies, and then these 3 dimensions of effectiveness. And then I again put numbers, and I don't have the time to go into the details of the numbers, unfortunately, but in my paper, I try to motivate these more. And then you see here that the product of these numbers, which is like the overall effectiveness, you see that effectiveness is much higher for regulation than for the others. And in effect, you see that regulation is more than 60% of the total contribution of all the policy instruments. And if I now assume that all cities apply this type of policy, then I arrive at 20%. If I take a more realistic perspective, that 1/3 of the cities worldwide is ambitious and the remainder is half as ambitious, I arrive already at a lower value of 13%. So now I have 3 estimates, 6%, 13%, 20%. this is, what I want to illustrate is much lower than the 70% that the earlier studies suggested. So I'll draw more conclusions, policy relevant conclusions on the basis of this later. Given the time, I want to move on to COVID. COVID particularly spread in urban areas, arguably because of a high population density, but as Catherine said, it also has to do a lot with how many people are there. But I think population density certainly will play a role, because even in big cities we saw that in certain highly dense neighborhoods, concentrations of COVID impacts were high, and that spilled over to other neighborhoods easily. Of course, high density has to do with crowding of people, meeting, transport, communication in general. But I'm sure there is a lot of work underway to get a better grip on what are exactly the factors, and probably we cannot generalize between all the cities. But what I'm interested in here is to see what is the impact of COVID on climate action, and particularly the COVID pandemic and its experience, and also the lockdown or the confinement associated with it. Did they change work and commuting habits? Is this temporarily or permanently? Has it changed awareness of links between climate change, biodiversity, and the emergence of viruses like COVID? More negatively, do we see more waste? Do people worry about that? Because of plastics use, we see more plastic everywhere. We haven't seen the waste consequences of that, but we will see them. Another issue is limited pool of worry, a psychological concept that says if there's a problem that occupies people's attention, then they will give less attention to another problem. So do concerns about COVID distract from concerns about climate change? And of course, in relation to this also, because of COVID, we've seen an economic crisis. Does that acquire priority? And do limited public funds for climate action, for subsidizing or for healthcare, push away funds for climate action? These are questions that you can raise here. So regarding the limited pool of worry, with colleagues, we did a survey, and we did it before the COVID epidemic, and we did it afterwards. We repeated it. And then we saw, indeed, that there is some indications of this limited pool of worry. So here we see a distribution of concern from no concern at all to a lot of concern. And here we see the same distribution. We see that it shifted a little bit to the left. So fewer people have a lot of concern now for climate change, and this has shifted more to moderate concern. Yeah. We also did an open survey, open-ended set of responses. We did a computational linguistic analysis to avoid subjective interpretation of the results. So what we did is, with computational techniques, see if there's common wording found in the different responses. We applied a technique called topic modeling. Then you can identify different topics. So we had a survey of more than 2,000 people. We did this in July 2020. And we have some preliminary results. We haven't finished all the work because there's a lot of data. So here we summarize the results. It's quite dense. And what we see here, we asked two questions. We asked people if they think that the COVID experience affects people's climate action, and if it affects government's climate action or policies. And we see a lot of correlation. We see that goes in the same direction. That's partly because many people don't see a clear distinction between these two things. So many people respond to both questions in similar ways. So they don't see that governments set policies that may change behavior of people, and that people may also voluntarily change their behavior, for instance. And not everybody sees that clearly. A lot of other people see that clearly. What we see is that there's more positive estimation of how people behave, and more negative valuation of how governments behave. Government is orange, and red is people's action. So these are all topics that come out of the responses of different individuals. So if people use the different wording, then they end up in the same topic in a way. And on the positive side, you see, for instance, that people say many people stay at home and pollute less, or there's more teleworking and less travel, or COVID clearly is an environmental wake-up call. On the negative side, we see that people stress that there's insufficient resources for climate now, that people are myopic and only focus on COVID and not on climate, that COVID adds to waste, and that's especially repeated here. That's the most negative with regard to the people's action, and it says that it stresses very much that people just contribute more to waste. Well, there's more to say about this. Let me summarize a little bit the other findings. So on the positive side, the most important finding is that there is a strong belief among some people that there is a prolonged and reinforced pro-environmental behavior that is additional now because of the COVID experience. And it's more common among younger people, highly educated people, and male respondents. And it's also more common among people who believe that climate change is a serious threat, or people who positively assess the confinement, who didn't see that as so negative. On the negative side, topics dominate that say that funding of climate action is limited due to a focus on healthcare and economic recovery, and this waste issue, and also that government mismanaged the COVID pandemic. And these two gentlemen are very representative. One disappeared, let's see what happens to the other. Some recommendations for policy and politics. With regard to the city role and contribution to climate mitigation, in order to use the potential of cities, I think there's a role for national governments to harmonize the climate policies in cities, because cities are talking a lot about things, but they're not implementing very strongly regulatory policies. And also this can avoid leakage, because what happens if some cities do it and others not, that in the long run, industries and people will move more to the cities that give maybe more freedom. And that's not what we want, of course. But we see that there is some degree of greenwashing in cities. Some mayors are also going to sell their cities as green and good. And there's also this conflict between solving local environmental problems and global environmental problems. Not all reduction of local emissions is good for climate change. I'll say more about that in the next slide. What's also important is that you coordinate local and national policies, that each of them occupy areas where they have strengths to avoid overlap, to assure complementarity. We have to make sure that cities focus on their strengths, not on their weaknesses. So for instance, cities can help a lot in modal shifts in transport, through parking zones, through bicycle lanes indeed. Generally, I think we have to moderate optimism about the contribution of cities to solving climate change. That's maybe logical for some people, but not for everybody. But most emissions are not under the control of urban authorities. For instance, something that's not so obvious, building norms. You could say cities can set more strict building norms to make buildings energy efficient. But these building norms nowadays are at the national level mostly. They emerged through cities historically, but then they were standardized across cities by national governments. And they're now usually under the control of national governments. I mean, there are differences between countries in this respect, evidently. But also other emissions than buildings are not directly under the control of cities. Take household consumption through value-added taxes. That's under the control of national governments mostly. Agricultural and industrial emissions, or even cars. Most kilometers driven by cars are outside cities, not in cities. I checked it for the Netherlands, country which I know well, and there it's 80%, and the Netherlands is quite an urbanized country, but the estimates are that 80% of kilometers driven in the Netherlands are outside cities, so not under the control of cities. And then regarding the COVID pandemic and confinement, probably it has a temporal effect on low carbon emissions. And we have to realize also that emissions have not gone down so much as many had hoped. And at the same time, economic recovery is fairly rapid, and it will involve high carbon sectors because we haven't implemented in the meantime climate policies to limit these sectors yet. So I want to give a few final personal impressions related to Spain and Barcelona, because this is where we work, where I work and live, like Catherine. Regarding Spain, I think that's also a bit consistent with what she said already. The role of cars remains dominant. This is not something you change overnight, of course. Spanish infrastructure, in my view, is characterized by ample infrastructure. And together with the warm climate and the hilly topography, this encourages car use. I come from a country where bicycle use is dominant, and I'm a bicycle user, but here it is difficult with the hills and the temperature sometimes. And my children bike, but they don't bike like I do, and I fear to send my children on the street with all these cars. And the problem is also here, many car drivers are not used to drive a bike. In other countries, everybody drives a car and a bike. So if you are in the car, you know what it is to drive a bike. But here, many people have no empathy for bicycle users. That's also something that's difficult to change. Then people say, of course, we need more electric vehicles. And in Spain and Barcelona, we're a little bit behind for obvious reasons. But even if we achieved it, we cannot be too optimistic because, of course, electric vehicles are good for local emissions and living conditions. But they're still far from a solution for global emissions because the life cycle emissions for electric vehicles, they don't look yet favorable. These emit surprisingly many CO2 and other greenhouse gases, apart from other environmental problems that they generate. Regarding specifically Barcelona, Catherine mentioned the superblocks policy, which is interesting. And again, creating car-free zones is great for local living conditions, but it has a limited effect on overall urban CO2 emissions, which I'm concerned about. It may even increase these by forcing detours of urban traffic. And generally, another issue that's kind of an interest of me, the tendency of Spanish cities to have one-way streets with multiple lanes, sometimes 3-4 lanes, invites for speeding, but also for detours, both contributing to additional emissions. So there's a lot to think about, I think. Well, I just scratched the surface. I hope I made you curious, and I'm sure there's a lot to debate. And this was the end of my lecture. If you're interested, 2 papers give more details on the 2 dimensions of my lecture. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jeroen. I think it is clear from both papers that a change of paradigm is needed urgently to mitigate climate change and the effects that it has on both human and planetary health. But it's also clear from both presentations that you weigh certain aspects differently, which is nice, as a disputatio has to be a bit controversial. And I see that there is disagreement about the role of the cities. There's probably some disagreement about population density and its relation to pandemics. Yet let me start by voicing some of the questions that I have received, and I invite our audience to jump into this discussion and to send as many questions as you like to the questions and answer through the questions and answer channel, the Q&A channel, which I will then gather together and try to present orderly to our 2 speakers. The first question goes to Catherine and addresses what you called, Catherine, the rethinking of the city as an organism. The question is whether this is really a convincing analogy, as cities are artifacts and are not and will probably never be organisms. In particular, the question asks whether it wouldn't have been more appropriate to speak about building cities on a more human scale, which may give you the same outcomes than the metaphor that you used, but which makes much clearer the subject-object relationship between society and cities. Catherine.
So shall I answer directly? Well, that's an interesting point, I think. And the human dimension is not, let's say, taken away from that idea, but I on purpose let's say, spoke about this idea of the city as an organism, because I wanted to insist on the fact that really this interrelation with the territory is so important. And it is more and more important as we less and less understand about ecological conditions. And it is, as we have seen, more and more necessary if we think of flooding, and especially if we think of the cities under the threat of climate change. So the human scale is extremely important, but also this idea that, and there are also intents here in Barcelona to, well, of course, to see the city itself as an organism, in the sense that infrastructures are interconnected and everything. If you take out one piece, you as if it was an unhealthy or healthy organism. I'm not so much speaking about this, I'm not so much understanding it under this aspect, but much more under this, let's say, contextualized relation with the territory. So if you don't know what your skin is like or how your blood flows through, you have a problem, right? And that's what I think has to be very much reinforced, because we scratch on the surface and we build and we extract, and we don't really, let's say, take into account this importance with watersheds and wind and heat conditions, etc., as much as we should do as sustainably thinking urban planners and also politicians, of course.
Another question to Katrien as well relates to your assessment of the role of cities in the mitigation of climate change. Jeroen is very critical about that and gave us numbers which speak for themselves. But what do you think about the role of cities in that? Maybe also beyond the direct question of emissions.
Yes, I mean, I think what Jeroen was explaining is very relevant, and this is also something I'm worried about, because there is indeed all these, and in fact, that's where you probably disagree, and you are saying that the cities have less of an importance in the first sense of production of emissions, right? But then also in the way of how they can, let's say, of how they can counteract towards them. So I think this is a very important point that you're making. And under my analysis, of course, there is this much more of a wishful thinking, and I do believe that cities have to somehow be, and you can see this here in Barcelona, you can see this in many cities, they have to, let's say, relate to each other as a network of cities. They have to understand their role as the major centers of human life somehow, and they have to undertake their own at least local, let's say, efforts, right? And this, as Jeroen was clearly saying, this might not have an impact so much on the global reduction of emissions, and that's another point. And this is especially the point also in cities that are so globally connected and are so related to the global effects. But I think it is relevant on a local scale, and it is relevant also in the sense that cities are also spaces of interaction and communication. I don't like so much the word of the civismo and the citizen education, but somehow this has a lot to do also with how each individual in a city is acting and is dismissing or not, or is using or not, or is contributing to producing emissions, to using a car or not. So in that sense, I do think the cities have a major role, and a good governance in a city, I do believe is really necessary in that sense, even though, and this is clear, the national legislations, as Jeroen was very clearly exposing, is there sometimes not very helpful in that sense. And that applies to all countries that we know. This is also the case for European regulations, etc. And especially this idea of the Green New Deal that's now in the mouth of everybody can also, as Jeroen was saying, it can also be a greenwashing effect, half a greenwashing effect, and that would obviously not be very helpful for none of us. But still, I do hope that there is the power from city governments, because also cities and important cities are looked at more and more in a global context as well.
And maybe I can I add something here, because it's an interesting topic. I think for me specifically, the issue is, I guess, that I see in many cities a lot of enabling policies, like, for instance, providing more public transport, bicycle lanes now. But the studies that show how that affects the behavior of people who are using the car show very low degrees of change. So, for instance, more public transport reaches just 5 to 10% of the people who are in cars, because these people will always complain public transport is not good, it's not enough, but that's not the issue. They just find a car more convenient. And if you go to Barcelona, for instance, with a car, it's very easy to park, because they have implemented in so many places now underground garages. You can go exactly to the spot where you are. There's no limitation of cars. It's perfectly attractive. I know it because I sometimes do it also, I must admit. So in order, and it's also difficult to change that, because these investments in parking garages, and they're in all modern cities now, they've been huge. There's huge financial interest associated with it. So to revert that, if you want a policy to limit cars, you limit the parking space. But that's not going to happen. Cities are not going to do that on their own. In Barcelona, it's even so the case that in many neighborhoods you can park freely on the street. And that often leads to a lot of traffic in many places. I know it also from other cities. I know Zaragoza, my wife comes from there. In Zaragoza, if there's a place left by a car, 2 seconds later, someone parks there. And you see always traffic around here. These people are all searching for, and that leads to more emissions. And yeah, these things are very difficult to change by cities themselves, because those kinds of policies are not attractive. You don't get voters supporting those kinds of policies easily. So that's why I'm saying national governments have to push cities in a certain direction, more regulatory policies for all of them, obligatory. Otherwise, it's going to take too long to solve climate change, in my view. You know, I see that I'm quite radical on that. I see that Barcelona is doing good things. Barcelona is in the lists now of 10 most sustainable cities in the world, but I don't see a diminishing of car use. Then I'm not convinced, you know. If those are the most sustainable cities with so many cars, well, then we're not going to solve these problems easily, I think. Maybe someone in the audience is disagreeing with this. They could put a question or remark in the chat, maybe.
Yes, I have received a question which has to do with this remark or with your answer, namely whether you think that more compact cities would allow to reduce emissions.
Well, there is evidence for and against it. There's no, because it depends also on cultural habits. So, but it is true. I think, for instance, for the US, I saw a study that showed that New York is the most energy efficient city simply because everybody's traveling by subway. So of all the population, a large majority travels by subway, whereas maybe it's a very American picture, whereas in the smaller cities, there's more sprawl, and it's very easy to get by car to the center of cities, so there's much more car use. But I should add one thing which I had on my mind and I forgot to tell, is that we should realize also that many cities in rich countries, in developed countries, are mature. They're not going to change fundamentally. The infrastructure is there. And in fact, we know also from history, important roads, important connections are there historically already. Many roads were started by paths where the Romans were walking, and even further back. Once there is a main connection between 2 points in space, humans use it and everything is constructed around it. It will never change. The main city structure in cities is there. And so it's also very difficult to change cities. Of course, you can make higher buildings, but before you turn a city from a normal city to a very dense city, that takes also decades. So it's nice to talk about this, but it's also a bit esoteric, because we're not going to change the density of cities overnight for climate change. And if it's then even doubtful if that will help a lot, I wonder if it's a good strategy. This debate matters maybe more for cities that are growing and expanding a lot in developing countries. But the problem for those cities is often that the preoccupation of the governance is with day-to-day issues, and they don't have the luxury often to think ahead of the climate consequences. This was also a clear conclusion of the IPCC report on cities, that we see that where in the world there is more room for fundamentally guiding the development of cities, there is not the political and the financial support, you know. So, and in cities in the Western countries where there is the will, there are these opportunities missing, in fact.
Yes, I mean, this is really, these are important points to think. I mean, for sure, the more compact a city is, the less movements are produced, the more compact also the buildings are, the less emissions come out of individual, let's say, sprawled one single family homes, right? Or in comparison to denser built environments. So that's for sure the case, and that's what we tend to, let's say, go away from, even though we have this knowledge, and we tend to, and people are tending to want to sprawl out, as I said. But also we have to take into account, and that's what I was also trying to say, that is a fear that I have with the pandemic now. People are, first of all, they rather use the car than the public transport. This is something we can clearly observe here in Barcelona. We have had at the beginning of the year, we have started with the let's say, prohibition of the old cars coming into the center, and we have started with very, let's say, rather radical ideas of reducing the car influx into the city. But in recent times, you can see even on a Tuesday mid-morning, the streets are congested, and this is certainly the case because people are not wanting to take the subway right now, which is also, again, understandable. But that's also a kind of a big issue that we have now to deal with, because it seems that all the efforts to go for more compact, less car-dependent cities now with the pandemic also are kind of dismantled, because people, and I personally knowing people that have just been leaving the city because they are afraid of the density as a phenomenon. They are afraid of being too much in these kind of dense environments. It's also a question that I also mentioned. It's a question of cost. It's a question of the inaffordability to live in an inner city center, like in Barcelona or like in the major cities, because housing is, especially in the denser and the maybe more sustainable neighborhoods, is so expensive that if you lose your job, and if you are in this kind of intermediate situation without knowing what's going to happen, you can no longer afford to live in the inner city. So that's all these issues, and people then go out to the countryside, or rather go also out into less expensive, maybe less dense and less sustainable urban situations. So that's really a big conflict that we are now facing, I think.
Thank you, Katrin. This actually responds also to a comment that I received by one attendant who reminded us precisely of the fact that during the pandemic, people prefer their private car over public transportation. Related with what we have been saying so far, it seems that one key concept or key term to the discussion, which brings together many of the aspects that we have been touching here, is actually mobility connectivity, right? This seems to be a key which is common to both, to climate change and to the pandemics, and of course also to the development of cities. Mobility and connectivity, no, as a key term in our discussion so far. But I have more comments from the audience. Yeah, Jeroen.
Yeah, maybe it's interesting. I think what I see personally as the most positive experience related to the COVID pandemic is that we have learned to use the digital media to communicate long distance now. In fact, when in the first weekend, when it was about when Spain was about to start the confinement, I had a trip to London because I had to give a lecture at the London School of Economics, and finally I did it online. It was my first lecture online. It was my own decision because I saw it as a risk to go through an airport at that time, but I could still travel. And since then, we're so handy now with all these technologies, and I communicate so much with my team. I see my research team more often than normally, I have the feeling. So I think we are less afraid. In the old days, I didn't like Skype a lot, and now I like all these technologies much better. And I hear the same thing from my colleagues, and I think it also holds for the business community. It's not just an academic community that's a real positive thing. People are habitual and they don't change easily, and they need a shock sometimes to change. So that's a positive element, I would say. Mm-hmm. Then regarding the electric vehicles, this question, maybe I can say just one thing. I made the comment already to say that the life cycle emissions don't look good, and in fact there is still a lot of debate among experts, and people can get very angry if on Twitter you show a graph where the emissions between electric vehicles and gasoline vehicles are not so very different. And then people start to say, but the underlying studies are uncertain and so on. But it is really true that these vehicles have a complex production process, and that at each stage in that production process, there is emissions. And that's in fact one reason why I'm strongly in favor of carbon taxation or carbon pricing more generally through markets. Is also possible, because then at every moment there is a decision made about a car, an electric car, there is an incentive to look for the low carbon solution. Same with renewable energy. People buy photovoltaic equipment now more in China than in Germany or the US because it's cheaper, but it's also produced with more carbon emissions. And then, so we don't have the policies in place to reduce the emissions of the production cycle, and that's a serious problem. So it's right what the question raises, that the emissions, the local emissions will be reduced, but not the global CO2 or greenhouse gas related emissions. And that's a serious problem if we scale up electric vehicles very quickly, because we have to really ideally first scale up renewable energy, and only if we have a lot of electricity that's renewable, then we can go large scale to electric vehicles. But it seems we're moving the other way around, and that's very dangerous.
Thank you. Another attendant says the following: Cerdà studied wind direction and planned the buildings and streets to capture sea breezes and stop cold winds. Like Ximenes, I would add. Ventilation is now an issue to prevent COVID. Any comment on this?
Well, I would say we cannot see away from that, right? We have to, whenever now any new building that's going to be built, we have forgotten about these issues, right? And we have, the house where I live, for instance, is from the beginning of the 20th century, and there is ventilation because there's cross ventilation in the building. So it's all, that's why, let's say in a rather old building, you have a much better climatic condition than you have in a new building with all climatic, let's say, heatings, etc., and air conditions. So this is a must now for any architectural approach, right? To really consider these issues, and to again go back to these questions of what is the territory, what are the territorial conditions like, and not to build against the logics of ventilation, which for a long time has been done. And in speculative developments, this does just not matter, because you cannot select exactly how the plot stands and how you put the building, right? So in that sense, I would say, yes, of course, this is important. And we've seen that any space that has a little bit of an outdoor space, right? It has a little bit of a balcony, that has a little bit of a rooftop to go out for. And this is so much more quality of life, as if you are in Cerdà's, unfortunately in Cerdà's, in Eixample, there are so many flats that have, due to the speculative over constructions, etc., have very bad living conditions, because there's a lot of noise. There is only inner courtyards without any cross ventilation. So that's quite sad to imagine that a lot of these Eixample flats have a much lower quality of life in that sense than maybe the buildings that I was showing, that are close to the mountains, that are self-built and are more precarious. in the sense of materiality, but have all these qualities of logics, of the contact with nature. Mm.
Isn't ventilation especially important for areas, for buildings where a lot of people meet, like schools? I know the discussion for schools was there in several countries, and in some countries, schools were all tested if they had sufficient ventilation. And in Spain, I think in many places, they just opened the windows. That's an advantage of the climate here. The temperatures are not so low. But my son, who's still in high school, he took on an extra sweater because, yeah, they opened the windows and it was a little bit cold at school, you know. But that's a solution too. But I think if we expect pandemics in the future to be more frequent, which is not unlikely because there might be a relation with biodiversity loss and climate change, then we might indeed think about that, especially in buildings where people meet regularly. Schools may be ahead of that.
And we have received quite a provocative question, which I may sum up like this. Shouldn't we say farewell to the cities in the future? Haven't hard lockdowns and telework shown us that maybe we can start to abandon cities in the 21st century?
Well, yes. I mean, there is, as I said, there is this paradigm change, right? And I think in some ways we can say, at least in the context that I'm looking at very closely in Latin America, I think this is somehow a reality already. And yes, I mean, we could say that the city, why living in a city if nothing is open? Why do you live in an inner city if there's no restaurant, if there's no museum, if there's nothing that you normally, all that you want to have in the city is closed? So why should you? And that's also a reason why certain people have been leaving out. And I know people who work in the university, they don't live in a city anymore. They prefer to live in the countryside and do their teaching from home. So it doesn't matter to them anymore. So in some ways, this idea of the digitalization, this dream that maybe 10 years ago, there was this idea that people, when they have a good internet, and that's obviously a condition, right? Then they would sit under the apple tree and would work from home. In some ways, this has not come true until now because everything was forced. And it's in Germany, for instance, there's a huge debate about still rural places having terrible internet. And this is also an injustice in that sense, right? And an impossibility for certain to work from home. But yeah, I mean, we could say that. And when I look at Spain, I'm thinking it could also be an opportunity. I didn't mention, but I was about to mention it in my presentation, la so-called España vacía, the empty Spain, right? There's so many villages, so many beautiful places that have, for unlogical reasons, I mean, only because of the fact that everybody was attracted to the cities, because nothing happened in the villages, because there's this most beautiful villages in the center. You can even buy villages here, right? You are even invited to take them over and to rehabilitate them. So there's a huge in this sense, I think there's a huge potential. And in fact, maybe this is one of the positive effects, because it doesn't make sense that everybody pressures into the major urban centers. And there's also a limit for, as we can see. I mean, the major urban agglomerations, they have, not only due to the pandemics, but they have these major problems of congestions and of, even if the cars were electric, that wouldn't make a big difference, because you still would be, if you're individually moving in a city, you would still be in this congested, you would lose so much time. We see now that we save so much time because we don't have to go anywhere. Of course, there's a huge, and this is also a positive maybe aspect of the whole idea of de-urbanize, or let's say of going away from the city, maybe, yes, and reactivating more rural places. But of course, on the other hand, this is very much related to infrastructures, which is the internet, which is then again probably more car dependency because the villages are, remote, etc. But yes, I agree with this is an option, and for many people it might be a real decision to say goodbye to the city.
Okay, Catherine, it seems that your reference to Cerdà has inspired our audience. There is another question related to Cerdà, and I read it. One of the important contributions from Cerdà was to stratify in vertical the different social classes instead of zoning them. Could this also have an effect on greenhouse emissions, reducing mobility? That is the famous Parisian 15 minutes. Question is to both, I guess, even though you introduced Cerdà.
Yes, I see. I mean, well, the social classes, and that's the point. There was this idea that people would live together, right? That people would share spaces, that people would not be separated from each other, and that's the quality also of this urban idea. And I mean, he has also very well studied Latin American cities at the time, and he has been inspired also by the idea of social revolutions, and in fact Cerdà was very much of this. He has thought so many things that I think are rescuable and necessary to refer to. I don't think I'm really understanding well that if it has an effect on the greenhouse emissions. Well, it could be, if we all live together, it would be much less. We would be much less segregated, right?
Well, because of reducing mobility.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, this is still, again, this is a behavioral issue, because not necessarily because you live with somebody of a different social class in the same house, you don't go to work, or you still might move around. But this idea also of having the 15 minutes and of living together, all kinds of people in one social context and one physical and spatial context, I find it ideal. I mean, I think I still, where I live, this is the case, but this is also threatened, as I said, because of gentrification, because of many issues that threaten inner city dwellers, not necessarily in the Cerdà, but also in the Cerdà extension. This is the case as well, and it is much more of a, in the central part, it's much more of a, also more expensive and more middle class or more higher class development than other areas. But still, the idea was that this grid is the same and is equal to all social classes, and that's why it's also so rescuable and so important to again and again learn from.
Maybe I can add something. I did recently another study. If I would have had more time, I would have included it in my lecture, where we try to look at the optimal city. There is a whole literature in economics, urban economics, optimal city structure, optimal city size. Because if you have too many people, you get too much congestion, too much criminality. So I personally think, for instance, that cities like Barcelona are too big. Madrid, Paris, I don't think this is an optimal city size. I like cities, but maybe it's too personal, cities that are maybe 100, 200,000, because then you can also have a natural gradient to lower buildings, lower density. Then it's not like very high, you don't get extremes, you get a natural gradient, and also the traffic flows are moderate. So the quality of life is good, there's less congestion, distance to work is also not extreme. What you get now with these big cities is that many people have to go outside the city to find work. So everybody's at the same time trying to go out of the city to the workplace. You cannot change these cities, but the optimal city size that we found in spatial structure was a lot of patching to create a mosaic of work and leisure and living. And that's the ideal structure. But you don't have all these increasing returns through, well, that's maybe a technical term, but all these benefits of high density and economies of scale in that case. So maybe it's not the logic of the mechanisms that have given rise to big cities, because there is a logic behind that, of course, to have in the city center a lot of services, high quality, high financial services coming together. That still holds for many cities. And it's difficult to break through that economic logic, I think, unless you put pricing policies in place. For instance, one famous policy suggestion comes also from a classic book in history, Progress and Poverty, which suggested that we should have a land tax, and only a land tax. We should not have income taxes. We should have a land tax, because land is from everyone. Your labor is from you. What you do with your labor is your right, but the land that you have is just stolen, it's on loan, and all the benefits to it or more importantly, the benefits that accrue to it because of social investments. For instance, subway station near to your house, your housing value goes up, but the investment was done by society. So the benefits should also go to society. I'm very much, that's Henry George, of course. I'm a big fan of that. And a lot of people support that, but we haven't applied it at large. Some cities have applied it, and there is an indication that these cities function better. They have lower density of buildings because the profits from land ownership were taken away from the owners. But it doesn't work perfectly. But it's something also that I think deserves to be mentioned in this context. Yeah.
So we have
yeah. And I just wanted to say, I mean, the medium-sized cities, that's for sure. And there's a lot of studies that declare that this is the best, let's say, the best size, the best way of living together in a medium-sized city. And that's why also in large agglomerations, you suddenly come up, there's all these ideas of polycentricism, because you need smaller units within larger cities. Right. So that you have still within a neighborhood. And this, I think this is also something that we lived again more and more in the pandemic, as we couldn't leave our neighborhood further out than a certain amount of meters, right? So people very much more realized what the scale and what the quality of a neighborhood is or is not, maybe, right? So in that sense, this is really, and this is the also the, I mean, the 15-minute city in Paris is a little bit alluding to this idea that you have a connection between people that are close to you, and you have everything in close by, and you are you're not having to move onwards so far.
Yeah,
I have another 2 questions from the audience, which I will just report together, and maybe these are the last 2 questions that we address. First is a remark that Jeroen will probably like to deal with, and it has to do with net zero carbon. And the remark is that probably what is needed is to control emissions in production and in industry rather than in the cities and with regard to car transportation.
Yeah, that's a good point, and it relates a little bit to my calculations that if it's true that maybe maximum 20% of emissions are covered by city authorities, then 80% is covered by something else, and there's a lot, of course, that's related to industry, electricity production for other activities than those in the city, agriculture. So indeed, a lot has to come from that. There's also the other view. There's also the view that we don't have to do anything except make energy completely low carbon, renewable. But I think what it forgets is 2 things. First of all, that the conversion of our energy system into a renewable energy system will take up a lot of fossil fuels and therefore create a lot of emissions itself. And secondly, that will go too slow. It will just go too slow. So we need to do anything to reduce emissions. And therefore we need to have policies that have an extremely broad reach, that don't leave anything out. Also for 2 other reasons, that there's no leakages, because the economy has the tendency to shift its focus from low carbon to high carbon, because high carbon generally works well. It is attractive. Anything that we like to do as humans uses up a lot of energy. Moving around, skiing, also using all this electric equipment in the house, it uses energy. Being flexible, you're mobile the whole time on, it uses energy, the battery goes down. When I had my first mobile, I put it off at night. I don't do that anymore. I don't have that habit. But nowadays you want to be connected, but it has an energy cost. Any email that you send, well, I don't know if it's true, but I remember one calculation that said that if it's an email without an attachment, with a little text, it costs like 7 grams CO2 emissions. But if there's a big attachment, of course, you make more machines move around the world to get your email to the destination. It's more emissions. People don't realize that we're continuously emitting. Every decision that we make is creating emissions. We have to make sure that every decision is as low emissions as possible. I think otherwise we're not going to make it. Just making the electricity system renewable, that's not going to lead sufficiently quickly to net zero carbon. Okay, I'll leave it at this.
And the last question refers to what Catherine said about empty spaces in the cities, empty hotels, but also empty office spaces. Is this a sign of a paradigm change, a change of paradigm for urbanization, or is this just a transitional effect that is limited in time?
This depends. I mean, we've had the whole post, let's say the deindustrialization also came across obviously with the abundance of structures and buildings. And of course, in the case of the hotels, right now it's obvious hotels are closed, so they have to be closed. But it might also mean that I'm convinced that there are too many hotels in the city, right? So we should really think maybe something is wrong with the fact that we live surrounded by so many hotels, right? They are now all blocked off and closed down. So in some ways we can only hope that also a more sustainable tourism will be on the agenda, hopefully, in the city, because this is also this extractive way of how tourism affected the city is really something that cannot go on, even though now people see that the complete drop off of tourism has produced a huge gap, right? And this is also because the city only depends on so little economic, let's say, economic factors, right? And yes, I mean, I think the office question is a question that is in many cities, is in Germany especially also is on the table since a long time. The question why we build office blocks, why we have buildings that are empty at night, that are let's say producing these urban emptinesses, even if you walk around at night, because there is nobody, or they have to be maintained they have to keep on all energy consuming machines, even though they are only utilized during office hours. So this type of building is, out of my understanding, completely obsolete. It's a non-adequate structure of a building, right? We don't need office blocks anymore. And even now, I mean, it is for sure that this is, and I wonder why still offices are being built, right? Because we really don't need this kind of infrastructure anymore, or not in that extent. And if so, they could be merged together with other structures. They could be integrated into, as it is done in many cities, intelligently, but still this kind of typology of the office building. And this, I think, is a paradigm change, but it comes very slowly, because we could have understood that years before, right? And we were always trying to, let's say, go away from this kind of consumptionist building. And then, of course, other firms or other global players are having these more human scale of integrated working in campus-like buildings or so, which are also no longer office blocks. And that's also where people work 24 hours. So in that sense, this is the office is like a city itself. But the office building itself is certainly something we have to rethink, and we can also reutilize, and we can restructure them. And there's lots of architectural firms that have already started doing that, right? To reutilize or refurbish office blocks from the 60s, from the 70s, from the 80s that are no longer in use.
Catherine, Jeroen, as we're coming to the end, what would be your one take-home message today, if you have one?
You go first, Jeroen.
Well, no, I think it's an extremely complex topic, because there are so many different cities. Also, I looked into, in my calculations, I tried to find out how many cities there are worldwide, and nobody knows. So there's different estimates. Some say 50,000, others say more than 100,000, but it depends, of course, on the definition of a city, and that's already, the legal definition of a city is already different between countries. So in some countries there are very small cities, and in other countries cities are always big sized entities. So yeah, I learned during my studies that it's such a complex topic, that cities have so many different faces, and Katrine's beautiful lecture with the collage of photos also showed these many different faces. So it's very difficult to generalize, and that's what we scientists sometimes do. Katrine less than me, I think, and that's why we're also complementary. But I, in my work, if I make models and calculations, I have to generalize, I have to average, I have to aggregate, and that's necessary, but it's also extremely difficult for cities. I realize that. So that's something, that's why we can do still a lot of research, and we can still have a lot of debates on this topic, unfortunately, to some extent, because we want to make good decisions and we don't know always, for instance, the compact city or not. That's, for me, an exciting issue. I see advantages and disadvantages. And what does exactly mean compact? High buildings or smaller roads? Because just a last comment here, that what I noticed in Spain, for instance, in Zaragoza very much, there's a lot of land in Zaragoza around Aragon, because Aragon is not densely populated. So it seems they have wasted a lot of space. And if you go through Zaragoza, you see extremely high buildings, but extremely huge infrastructure. So from one building to the other, there's huge space. And I always think, why didn't they make the buildings lower? Because they have enough space, and that's a nicer environment. But yeah, it's clearly an urbanistic concept that was applied there. And I don't know if I would call Zaragoza in that sense a compact city even. Maybe it's not, but so compactness is already an uncertain issue in that sense. Barcelona is probably, and Madrid certainly also is. Well, I'll leave it here. A lot of thoughts, I suppose. Thanks.
Well, I just wanted to, I mean, I feel the city is a cultural achievement since ever, right? So I love cities, and I think the beauty is also, as Jeroen was saying, cities are so different, and you can hardly compare one city with another. I mean, globalization has produced a lot of unification and a lot of shopping streets looking all the same. That's probably also something that hopefully should go into the past, but that's also now a question of what to do with these, let's say, globalized, now empty urban centers where nobody shops anymore because everybody shops online. So this idea of the exchange that I also put on the table is really, I think we have to redefine of what that means, that the city is a place of exchange, beyond this kind of extractive logic of capitalism as what also drives cities. And I mean, speculation has always been driving the development of cities. And this is true in the case of Cerdà. This has true been with the Romans. This is true since the existence of the cities. And pandemics and dramatic situations have also been part of our history since ever. And somehow on a local scale, the cities or the populations have to deal with that. And I mean, if we think that maybe this situation is producing the exodus, as we said, or maybe only a retreat from, or a less attractiveness, cities being less attractive, this is nothing negative, because as we said, there's too many people that have worldwide gone or are still driving, are pressuring into the cities, right? And are having this expectation. And if there was more of a rural, this famous rural urban divide that we have, right? If there was more of a rethinking of the rural, which is extremely necessary, because still we all depend on natural goods and on agricultural production, unless this is also done by industries, right? Or somehow chemically, but we need this to be much less in a disequilibrium as it is today. And if that was the consequence of the pandemic, that people would, let's say, that also governments rethink rural development. In Germany, at least, they say they are trying to do that, because it's a need also to have better accessibility, to have better internet, to have also better, I mean, the question was always also education and healthcare, right? So that's also why people pressure into the cities beyond the economic interests. So, I mean, in general, it would be much better if we had a less of this duality and less of this also injustice that we have on a global scale, and that cities would not, the mega cities are fascinating places, but they are for sure not sustainable in that sense. And if this would reduce, if people would not have this need only to pressure into the cities and to migrate into the cities as whatever kind of exploded workers. That would be a positive effect for the future, in fact.
Catherine, Jeroen, let me thank you again, also in the name of Ricard Guerrero, for your presentations, for the discussions. And I wish to extend my gratitude, our gratitude, also to our audience for your patience, attention, and also for your input through the Q&A. Let me also thank the IT staff of the Institut d'Estudis Catalans, the Catalan National Institute, who have made possible this virtual meeting and who are with us from the very beginning until the very end. And of course, also the staff of the Barcelona Knowledge Hub, and particularly Kimberly Katte, for taking care of everything and ensuring that this went smoothly from the beginning to the end. In addition, I would like to mention the sponsors and partners of the Barcelona Knowledge Hub who have also contributed to this disputation, namely the Catalan government, the Generalitat de Catalunya, the city of Barcelona, and the Caixa Foundation, who have been partners of the Barcelona Knowledge Hub for many years and are also contributing to this year's or last year's, however you want to have that, disputation, to the 2020 disputation, which we held now in 2021. This will not be the only disputation in 2021, because we're again on the track, and will of course have our 2021 disputation, the 9th disputation during this year. We schedule it for the fall, as we have done until now, and we already have many ideas of what topics to address. Possibly we will engage in a discussion on the psychological effects of a pandemics, but we will let you know, our public, our audience know in advance. And we hope that all of you enjoyed tonight's discussion, and that we will have you again with us in November or October when we schedule the 9th disputation. So thank you all. Thanks to the speakers, thanks to the audience. There is no applause now, it's just silence, but please imagine the applause from our over 100 participants that joined us tonight. Thank you very much, and stay safe, as we say in these times. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, thank you.
Bye-bye, thank you very much, Alex. And you, Jeroen, as well.
Yes, I enjoyed it a lot. Are we alone now, or we're still with the whole audience?
So.
I think they will leave.
Nobody knows. Nobody knows.
Don't have the overview, how many people, how the curve went over time, you know?
Not me.
But I enjoyed it a lot, I must say. I enjoyed it a lot. It was nice.
Yeah, I think we had a good discussion. Given the circumstances,